All right, welcome to Mindful Baking, or Mindful Baking Workshop this Tuesday in November. I am Rachel Waugh. I am the founder and executive director of the Museum of Food and Culture, which is based in the Denver metro area. Right now, we're still doing pop-up and virtual events. I have a feeling some more people will join us as we get going, but I want to make sure that we use your time well, Austin. So we're just going to get started. I am super excited to host this because it's with one of my favorite people, talking about something that I find really fascinating and I love, which is food and mindfulness, and really thinking about kind of being present and taking joy in the foods that we make, instead of just thinking of cooking as a chore. And I feel like bread baking is especially one of the best ways to really think about being mindful and being more in the present. So I'm happy to introduce Eric Pallant, who is one of my favorite people of all time. He's zooming in from Western Pennsylvania. And Eric is a twice named Fulbright scholar and sourdough aficionado. He wrote the book about it, quite literally. He's also an expert on topics of sustainable development, food and agriculture, educational innovation, and writing creative nonfiction. And he recently wrote a book called Sourdough Culture, The History and Science of Sourdough, which we're going to talk about. Oh, sorry. That's an outdated title. Apologies. And he is also working on another book, which I'm hoping that he'll tease for you. But basically, one of my favorite people. I am always excited to collaborate with Eric and learn all the things from the bread master. So without further ado, I'd like to kind of get into our mindfulness zone, and then Eric will do a self intro and we'll go from there. So I invite you to close your eyes and take a moment to set your intention for the next hour. And Eric, you're welcome to do this too. How would you like to be present during this event? How would you like to feel and be after this event? Visualize yourself later on in this hour being your favorite self. What does that look like? If you want, you can jot down this idea and put it in front of you to keep in mind as we go, or you can just keep it in the back of your brain of how you would like to be in this space. So before we get started, please take a moment to pause and observe how you feel. Release the tension from the day that you're carrying, any stress, anything like that. I like to shake it out a little bit. Release any aches or pains, and just observe your body and your emotions without judgment in this moment. Alrighty, let's get started. So Eric, I did a little brief intro for you, but I would love to hear from you how you got started in sourdough baking, why this is important in this day and age, and especially when you could just like go to the store and buy bread for like $2 or whatever.
Well, you could buy bread for $2 or whatever. And I was thinking of like, where do I want to be at the end of this? And so much of baking for me can sometimes be stressful, right? So I would love to get to the end of this without cursing, without having a dough drop on my feet, or have a bread collapse, or my cuts just go totally wonky and stuff like that. I got into bread because of this. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a good view of this starter here. And you'll see it says Cripple Creek on it. And I know it says Cripple Creek now because that's where I came from. And that's what my book is about. But I have been using this starter for 25 years. And I thought that's a long time to have a living anything alive, right? Like none of my houseplants were that old, and none of my kids were that old at the time. And I wanted to know, well, how old is it, right? And I know that bacteria and yeast, they only live, for, like when they're active, for a day or two, though you can put them to sleep and they can stay in suspended animation for years and years. But if they're active and being fed and so, like they're reproducing a day and then they're dead. And so like, how is it that this ecosystem has been alive for 25 years? And so I called the person a cold call, which for me is calling anybody is hard, but you know, people hadn't seen it in 25 years and said, I don't know if you remember me, but you gave me a sourdough starter. And they said, oh yes, I remember that day very well. And they remembered who gave them the starter, and then I followed it all the way back. And so this particular starter is from Cripple Creek, Colorado, which is on the backside of Pikes Peak, from the gold rush of 1893. And it's at least that old. And like I don't have a way of figuring out how it got there. But then it's like, okay, who invented sourdough? And who invented sourdough bread? And what's the difference between sourdough and, you know, a package of yeast that looks like that? And why do the breads taste different? And so, and I can answer any of those questions when you want. But I also, as you indicated, live in a very small town in Northwest Pennsylvania that does not have a bakery and has not had a bakery for all the time that I've been here. It's had one bakery, but they didn't make great bread for a period in the middle there. But to me, there's nothing quite like homemade bread for what it can do for my mood and my stomach as well. And so I started making bread and then switched to sourdough. And this is before the internet and before like anybody was making sourdough. And so I learned to make sourdough bread by making a lot of mistakes. And but that turns out, I think, is how you learn a lot of things. Is what we say is we learn to read dough. You're doing that now, Rachel, by learning one recipe really well. It's just a great way to start. I would recommend that for everybody. And then once you've got that one under your hands, then you start adjusting. Like, what happens if I change this flour to that flour? What happens if I change this liquid to some other liquid? And what if I double the recipe? What if I add nuts to the recipe or sunflower seeds or something, right? And then you're on your way.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that story. I always love hearing it of like how you started with a starter and then you wanted to trace the history of it, and then that started leading to so many more thoughts and experiences, and that's so cool. And then you wrote a book about it, like, you know.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I wish I could always say that writing a book was like, and then you write a book about it. It wasn't.
No, yes. Awesome. Well, let's get started. So like, just to give you kind of an overview of what we're going to do today. So we'll move through the different pieces, kind of through the different processes of the bread making, starting with noticing. So really paying attention to your ingredients as you're measuring and mixing. Then we'll move to your senses, where we start to do the kneading process. Then we'll talk about history and bread baking from ancient to modern bakers. And Eric will share some more about his book, which, Austin, you're going to get in the mail. And then finally, we'll wrap up with creativity and talk culture, shaping, and scoring, all throughout thinking about how bread can bring us into the present. So
before you launch there, Rachel, Austin, because it's just the three of us, just when you got a question, jump. Just
yes.
Just jump in.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Do you have any questions already? Like something you already are having trouble with?
No, I'm very curious about the kind of the mindfulness part of it, because this is something that's interesting to me, is the kind of the exacting nature of bread, especially in a place like Colorado, where we have to make those adjustments for things like altitude baking, as well as specific types of, and this is just purely off of making cakes and things like that, but like the way that moisture plays a part and rise and all of those sorts of things. I also, this is a weird tangent, but about 10 years ago, I took a trip to Alaska, and I had I had some sourdough pancakes from a starter that had started 138 years prior to me arriving there. So, and it just kept feeding and feeding, and that's something that's always been very, very interesting and curious in my mind. So I'm just excited to potentially be a part of something like that. My dad's had a sourdough starter since 2020, since the pandemic. So.
Oh wow, nice. Kept it
So many
going.
things to talk about. That
Yes, that's what I was thinking too.
that's great. And I will say just at the outset, the people I know from here, I've known several people who have gone from actually Meadville, which is the center of the universe, to the Rockies and brought their starters with them. And their experience is that it's not so much the baking changes or the moisture changes, but that the rise and the expansion is greater and better. With less air pressure, they get loftier breads and better rises, about which I'm jealous.
That just means you have to come out and bake here for a bit. Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to touch on a couple of the different pieces that you mentioned, like the age of sourdough as we go, how you pay attention to your bread in a way that like you end up with a delicious loaf. But I guess we'll get started at the beginning. So basically, how this is going to work, I have the silver bowled. I am working on the sandwich bread that I sent out in an email. So for anybody who's watching after the fact, you can follow along with me. And then Eric is working on sourdough bread, and that's the sourdough recipe that I sent out in the email as well. So the first piece is really starting with that noticing, and just like kind of grounding ourselves in primarily our sight and our senses, when thinking about measuring and mixing. So for you guys who are working on sourdough bread, this would be picking up at step 4. For me, I'm going to start right at the beginning. So as we get started, so focus on what you notice as you're measuring and mixing your dough together. If you're just starting the bread, pay attention to the tiny, tiny grains of yeast. Then I lost my yeast. So notice the tiny grains of the yeast. Pay attention to how they look, little cylinders, or focus on like the little bubbles that might be occurring in your sourdough starter. Notice the changes if you're testing the water in temperature before it's reaching lukewarm, and the splash as that you add it to the bowl. And I always love this part where I pour commercial yeast into the water of kind of how it spreads out and clumps in certain different places. And then like the happy marriage of the yeast and sugar, especially when they get really excited together. I'm using agave in this recipe. Pay attention to the color of the flour. Whether you've noted or whether you've made like one loaf or hundreds of loaves of bread, think about this process as if it were completely new to you. Or if you've made no loaves of bread, like you are an alien from a far distant planet who's never seen anything like yeast or a sourdough starter before. It's all different. If you want, you can even like focus your attention on the bubbles as they're popping up and see if you can predict where a bubble will start next. Now, Eric, as you're working with your piece, I'd love to like start to direct our noticing attention to understanding what is happening in our bowls, whether we're using a commercial yeast and sugar, or if we're doing sourdough. Like, how are we getting started here, and
Glad you asked.
what's
I
happening?
want to add another sense, which is don't forget the smell. There's something about the smell of yeast that's coming alive. That's, you know, how about in your bowl? Do you smell it
Oh,
starting?
yes. Yes.
Right. And so this for you, Austin, I have here 3 different starters that I'm keeping alive. And they all smell different and behave differently. And so I've shown you Cripple Creek. I guess, is this the better camera?
That's great.
And Cripple Creek is the one I feed just whole wheat flour. And it has a very, this is the sourest of my 3. It pops you upside your head and says, this is a sourdough starter. It before it bakes, it can actually be a little skunky. It's got so many different bacteria in it that give it a very wild smell. And I have given this to other people, and that stays with it, right? I can always tell that this is a Cripple Creek starter, but this one also has a lot of vinegar going on, so it has that sort of acetic acid smell. Hey, we've got somebody else.
Yeah. Hi, Manasi. Hi. Are you baking with us or just watching? Are you baking with us or are you just watching today?
I'm sorry. I was pretty late, so I'm just going to be watching today.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so we're recording this, so you can follow along after if you'd like. But I'm glad that you're able to join us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Excited.
Right now we're just like talking about
Be right back.
oh yes, definitely. We're talking about kind of how we notice the beginning stages of bread making, the smells, the sights. I'm making more of a sandwich bread, and Eric is showing us his sourdough starters as well.
Right. So here's my starter I made. Actually, my wife Sue made from wild grapes here in Meadville in 1990. So just to catch you up, this one's from the Cripple Creek Gold Rush of 1893 in Cripple Creek, Colorado, and it's worked its way all the way to Meadville, Pennsylvania. And if you go look at my website, and you'll see I have a map of the world. It's now on pretty much every continent except Antarctica, where I've sent samples of this, which I love, right? Which is this, there's a fungal network of fungi inside here, and they are spread all around. And this one's a very sweet smell and very mild smell, and it makes really lovely bread. That's one of the ones I'll be making tonight. And then this one is, I don't know if I've ever shown you this, but this is a rye starter. I feed only rye to it, and it comes from a rye bread factory in the old Soviet Union in 1960, where, and there's a whole story that comes with this of these old babushkas who were using this starter to make millions of loaves a week, because that's what the Soviet authorities wanted to have happen. And it has a very sweet kind of fruity aroma to it, and it has a really strong rise to it, and it makes really different bread from my other starters. The hard part is that I have to keep them all alive and feed them and make lots and lots of different breads, but there aren't enough people to feed bread to, so I have to give it away a lot. So I'm hoping your starter, Rachel, is you're not, anyway, your yeast and sugar is starting to come along there. Good. What does your starter smell like? What do you smell?
My starter is it's kind of sweet. I fed it a couple hours ago. Here's what it looks like right now. So she's starting to
Beautiful.
cool. And I read somewhere that if I stir it regularly after feeding, like once an hour, it strengthens the gluten, or future gluten. So I've been doing that. So I just stirred this right before. Her name is Stay Puffed, after the Ghostbusters movie. But yeah, she definitely grew. Like, it's kind of hard to tell because
Yeah,
of the dirtiness of this container, but it started about here, and so it's risen about that much. So
yeah.
after this workshop, actually, I'll be making some sourdough bread.
That's
And then this,
Austin. Let's ask Austin. What does your sourdough smell like?
oh yeah,
I was also had a chance to use some very nice organic whole wheat flour. It's definitely got the sweetness to it. I also worked in a distillery for some years, and that I can't smell this and not smell that really cereal note of the barley. And I know that's a completely distinct smell, but it has the smell of like beer uh, in the brewing phase, or in the pre-brewing phase, the dry kind of grains sitting out there. So,
I know,
but mine, what's that?
isn't it a wonderful smell? And
It's truly, and I mean it in both ways. It's truly intoxicating. It's just really really aromatic and really, the hardest part about this is keeping it under the shelf and away from light for long enough, because I just want to keep on sniffing and smelling at it.
no, and to me, it's not. And one of the aromas is simply straight up anticipatory, is what I would call it.
yeah.
Knowing good things are on their way.
Yeah, it's ephemeral. It's a really really unique smell.
Yeah.
Manasi, do you have a sourdough starter that you're going to be using, or that you have used before?
Yeah, I just struggled. I'm on my phones. I struggled with the unmuting. I managed to actually kill my sourdough starter. So I'm looking forward to getting another one started. And I have to admit, I'm quite intimidated. Like when one reads of people who have baked sourdough bread, one reads of like 75% hydration or whatever. And I have to be honest, like I don't know what that means. So I've been too intimidated to actually bake one myself.
Okay. No worries. I also have killed many a starter, as Eric, like throughout the time Eric's known me, I think I've killed 3.
Okay.
So this is like the most recent iteration. It's sometimes hard to keep it up.
I have a question for all of you who have your starters thriving. Like, what do you do with them when you travel, when you're not around to feed the starter?
They will live in your refrigerator for weeks at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So unless you're going someplace for 6 months, don't worry about it. So if you send me an email, I have a thing that my daughter wrote, which is like, relax, it doesn't really matter. It's just like you will read all these things about the hydration rates and the frequencies and all this stuff. And she says, like, oh, it's fine. Just feed it occasionally, some amount of food and some amount of water, and it'll be fine. The way to think about it is it's like a house plant, which is there are directions, like you have to feed it, like you have to water a house plant on a regular schedule, and that's not how house plants grow. Like when it's warm and sunny out, they need more water, and when it's cold and dark out, they don't need as much water. So you have to sort of pay attention. But it's just it's a living thing. If you can kill it by ignoring it, but that's the only way to kill it. So long as you periodically give it some food and water, it'll be fine. But I'll send you this thing. It'll make you send me an email. I'll send you this little form. And if you're really curious, you go on my website and I can send you, if you want one of these starters, like one of these appeals to you, like you want to have Cripple Creek, this is your backyard, or Meadville, because it really makes great tasting bread, or something. I can send you those starters too, and you can start with that.
Yeah. And there are
That
also,
would. Thank you so much.
yeah. I was just gonna say there are also ways, and the way that Eric sends you, that starter, and like there are ways to preserve pieces of your starter like in the freezer, or you can dry it out so it's like a cracker and then restart it if you kill kind of the main body of it. So it's pretty forgiving. Awesome. And I think that goes kind of to the like noticing piece. And I like, as I'm making this bread too, I'm noticing if it at first it was too dry, now it's a little bit too liquidy, so I'm going to add some more flour as we get into the kneading part. So I'm actually going to turn this out and clear myself a little bit of more space. So as we get into this piece, I recommend also like really tapping into your senses, and like pay attention to kind of the heft of your dough as you're turning it out, and notice the weight as you're lifting the bowl, the sensations that will kind of come as we start to knead. And actually, as I say that, before I start really kneading, Eric, would you talk to us about like how you knead bread dough?
Yeah, I don't. Let me show you.
Ooh.
So I used to knead dough all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I love kneading, don't get me wrong. But so here's a dough I'm working on. You've got it in the other camera, not the one with my face. And this is called stretch and fold. And with a wet hand, about every 30 minutes, and I've talked to people, it's between 20 minutes and 45 minutes, so like I'm not very exact. You take your hand, you stick it in to the bowl, and you simply pull and stretch and fold it back over, give it a 90-degree turn, fold, do that 3 or 4 times, and it strengthens and builds the gluten. Don't let it rip. And you'll see it gets tighter each time, and we'll do it again in 20 minutes if we're still here. And that's it.
Oh.
That's it. So none of this 20 minutes, like you're going to look like your great grandmother with the shoulders out to here, and turn. So that's one way to knead. A second way to knead is the way that Rachel's doing. And then Rachel, I'm going to have you keep kneading for a minute.
Oh.
Do you know the slap and what's it called?
Oh my God. I've watched the Great British Bake Off. What is it? It's like you slap it and then fold, right?
Yeah, slap and fold. And yeah,
I lost a piece
there's
there.
something very satisfying about taking a loaf and just across and that's my favorite way to do it with kids.
I love that.
Because
oh, sorry.
Yeah. So that's the other way. But mostly these days, if you stretch and fold for a couple of hours, like you just have to be in the house, and every 20, 30, 40 minutes, when you remember, you walk by, you get a wet hand so it doesn't stick as much. And you give it a stretch and fold, cover it back up. I want to show you something about covering.
Oh, and I'll just say, like, while Eric is going to grab that thing, my way of kneading, I just kind of push with the palm of my hand out, and then I use my fingers to just pull back and make it a half, and then just kind of push and pull until it feels very long, and then I just like turn it and I do the same thing.
Right. And so
push and pull.
Stretch, if you're going to knead by hand, maybe 20 minutes, they tell you. I've never made it 20 minutes because I get bored. So if you make 15 minutes, that's pretty good.
Mm-hmm. And mine's feeling pretty good, actually.
It does look pretty good.
Thank you.
But the reason I can tell you with confidence that kneading is no longer necessary is you probably have heard of and seen the recipes for no knead bread, which is a way of saying that the proteins in the flour, what you're trying to do is get them to line up and form a string of gluten like that. And what you do if those network of gluten strands are well tied together, when the yeast exhale carbon dioxide and start to expand the bread, the gluten holds together. And so you get those bubbles or air pockets on the inside, which is what you're trying to do. And what we've figured out recently is that bread flour will, if you moisten it, what they call autolyse, line itself up all by itself. Right? So why it took 6,000 years of bread making to realize that the bread will do it by itself, and that all this kneading that we've been doing is probably not fully necessary, is I think one of the great discoveries of the last 20 years. Here's two more great discoveries you don't want to miss. These are just great baking hacks. One is the best cover for this is a shower cap, right? And so the shower cap fits perfectly on a bowl and has an elastic thing, and you can see in and keep track of what's going on the inside. And the even better hack is when you have to clean all these things off, are, you know, these things that you get your oranges in and your onions in, they are perfect for cleaning out dough, and they fill up all those little things with dough, and then you can throw them out.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, this is genius. Start saving
That is
these.
so stinking smart. I cannot believe oh my gosh. I'm a bald guy, so I would never keep the hair products around, but that's so smart.
Yeah.
Right. No, but this is just like if you're buying navel oranges or you're buying onions or all those, right? You hate these things to begin with. But they are great for, then when you start using it, you can really clean out almost anything, and then you got to use before you throw them away.
Oh, I love that. Well, and I was gonna say one of my hacks for figuring out if the bread is done and like kind of ready to rest after I knead, because I didn't know that you didn't have to knead, but I'll say this if you want to knead, because I think it's a good arm workout. Is like it's kind of coming together into a ball, but also if you pinch it, it should feel like your earlobe. And that's just something that has been in my family for forever. Like if you pinch it, it has that kind of that level of like texture and squishiness to it.
That is so nice, because what I learned from my father-in-law, I can't really repeat in public.
Oh no.
Or other parts of your body that it reminded him of.
Oh well, as long as you have something to measure by, I guess.
Right.
And I will add, like, part of the thing of mindfulness, at least the way that I approach it, and the way that we're approaching it here at this event, is if you have fun, you are being in the present, which is very mindful. So the act of playing and enjoying what you're doing is mindfulness. I think there is kind of that common perception of, oh, I should sit down and meditate and like be one with my feelings. Oh, the bread's out. Nice.
Yeah.
And I would say that like this laughing together, learning together is also a way to be mindful. Also, let's ooh and ah over the bread that Eric has. That's beautiful.
Right, it is. So this is made with, I had leftover butternut squash. And
gorgeous.
And this is a very simple. We'll talk about. Oops, sorry. We'll talk about scoring and the importance of scoring and why we have to score, which is to put a cut into the bread. And this one had a really nice open up on it. And oh man.
Color.
Butternut squash. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so Eric,
so Rachel,
I would like to learn a little bit more about kind of the function of rising, because now we've kneaded the bread, mixed it all together and everything, and now it needs to sit. And just personally, I've always found rising to be kind of inspirational of, you know, things sometimes get very fast paced in the world that we live in. People want answers to their emails right away. you have to get this done by the end of the day. But the function of rising is like literally purposeful inaction. And I love that. And I've started to try and incorporate a little bit more of that into my life of taking very purposeful rest breaks, taking time where I'm actively not creating anything or achieving whatever goals I have for myself. And so I guess, what is the function of rising? Like, what's going on within here? And then I'm also curious if we could talk a little bit more about like the history of bread. This is a great opportunity for us all to ask some questions of the bread expert, Eric, but also like if you could just kind of mention earliest records of bread baking and all of that.
Okay, so let's start with rising. And I love the idea that there's like nothing you can do while bread is rising, in addition to letting the bread rise. But I'm going to change the analogy a little bit, which is that you've handed over the work. It's much closer, much more akin to farming or gardening, which is you have fed and cared for, if you're raising lambs or you're raising carrots, you've prepared their facilities, you've given them water, you've given them warmth, you've given them food and comfort, and now they're growing. And so your little lambs are getting bigger day by day, or your carrots are getting bigger day by day. And in this case, they're microscopic organisms who are actually pre-digesting the wheat for you. And in the case of yeast, they are working, commercial yeast is very fast. It's been selected to be the hybrid corn of a 1,000-acre field. It's designed to make a bread rise in an hour or two and be reliable. You don't have to, you can follow a recipe with yeast and know that in an hour, your bread is ready to, will have doubled in size, for example. Whereas sourdough, because I have 3 different sourdoughs, they behave differently. They each one has a different set of yeast species in it. So the yeast species in here are different from the yeast species in here. And there are bacteria in here, which are also reproducing and also growing their populations. And so as they find themselves in really perfect conditions, if you're a bacteria or yeast, you've just been handed a feast over here. And so they are reproducing like crazy. And while they're doing so, the yeast are generating a lot of carbon dioxide. And just so you know, Austin, the species of yeast, the most common species of yeast in sourdough is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the exact same species from which we make beer. And so that smell of beer that you were sort of anticipating is not so far-fetched, right? We think of as bread as just being solid beer and beer just being liquid bread, because the ingredients are really the same. You start with a malted barley or wheat, if you're making a wheat beer, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and you let them do their thing. They generate carbon dioxide. If there's enough gluten to hold the bread together, then my bread will rise. And if it's not enough gluten, then I put a cap on it. I have a carbonated beverage. But it's exactly the same process. So to answer your first question, Rachel, it's not that you're not doing anything, it's you've prepared the farm or the barn or the garden for a perfect growth scenario and just let the organisms do their work. At the end of which you're going to kill them by putting them in the oven so that you can eat them. And so that leads to the historical question, which is, I'll tell you a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you a question, which is, who figured out how to make bread? Right? So sourdough, because we're surrounded, we are bathing in bacteria and yeast. Everything around us, like your skin is covered with it, the countertop is covered with it. Even after you've washed your bowls, there's still bacteria and yeast in there. Certainly Like my cupboards are like, if you lick this, you know that it's not sterile, right? There's nothing sterile. And so if I put flour and water out on my countertop, in 2 or 3 days, it's going to start bubbling. Why bubbles? Because the bacteria and yeast have fallen in, or they were on the flour, and they are going to start to digest, eat the wheat that they've been given. And so that's the first sourdough. Like, nobody had to figure that out. Who figures out how to make bread? What do you think?
No, I feel like that would be one that people just are like, what is this? Let's put it on a fire and see if it's food, or like, let's taste it and see if it's good, kind of. I don't know, Austin, Manasi, what do you guys think?
I'm digging back into my, I'm gonna say Egyptian, possibly because of the heating process, maybe the African nations, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Vanessa, you have a guess?
So in India, we eat like a variety of flatbreads that we don't use yeast for. And one of the ways that originated, the process of cooking originated, is people discovered first, like, obviously, things were being fermented, alcohol was being made, and the grains that the animals were being fed were sometimes pre-digested, and those same grains were used to make flatbreads. Just similar to the sourdough process, the pre-digestibility was helping. um, um, Through that process, at one point people said, hey, this is disgusting, we don't want to eat like that, and then grains in their raw form were not suitable for consumption, and thus then this elaborate method of grinding them to flour and then patting them into flatbreads and then roasting them on open fires sort of came into being.
That's pretty accurate. That's pretty accurate. And Manasi, you're going to have to try. And again, after you email me and you get good at this, I'll send you a recipe for sourdough naan. That is just, oh my God.
Really good. We don't make a lot of naan with our usual Indian cooking because that's more like restaurant food for us, but that does sound delicious.
It is good. And then, but also, so dosas.
Yes.
What are the primary ingredients in dosas? Is lentil flour?
That's not flour, just whole lentils. There's a small white lentil called urad dal and rice. And again, they are soaked for some reason. So I would love to get into this a little bit more. They're always soaked separately and never together. And then they are ground separately and then mixed and left to ferment overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Guess what that is? That's a sourdough.
That is a sourdough, yeah.
Right, so that's how it was invented. Is somebody left out some dal, right, and some other grains. It didn't matter. It depended on where you were in the world. It started to ferment, which is just another way of saying bacteria and yeast did what they do. They fall in, they start to digest. It starts to bubble. It changes the flavor. If you let it go long enough, you'll have whiskey or beer or some kind of alcohol. But if not, if you catch it sooner and it's thick enough, you can make a pancake or a flatbread out of it. So it turns out that of all of the grains in the world, rye is the other slight exception. Wheat is the only one with gluten. Rye has a little bit of gluten, but not a lot. So a rye bread will rise just a little bit, but generally a rye bread is a dense, 100% rye bread is a really dense, solid brick of a bread. It's not very light and fluffy. Wheat bread is the only one that will do what Rachel's bread is doing right now, which is starting to rise as those things ferment on the inside. And then there's a second rise that happens inside the oven. And you have all of these trapped air bubbles and water vapor bubbles inside that network of gluten, and you heat them to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That gas in there super expands, and the bread springs in the oven, which is why you need to have a slice on the top to let it open up. Otherwise, you'll blow the top off. And there's nothing wrong if that happens. And if you're not using wheat or you haven't given it enough time, you're making a flatbread, which is equally delicious.
Well, one thing I want to draw our attention to as we're also thinking about mindfulness is like this history conversation is part of that as well. Like understanding that when you're working with bread in whatever form, it is part of this long history of bread baking. And I think that part is so cool. So whenever you turn out your dough on your workspace or you feed your sourdough, you're doing something that people have done for literally thousands of years. And that part is just so incredible to me. And that being said, I will also plug, Eric has a sourdough culture book, which Austin, I know you bought, but you can order it through the website. I'll also send an email out after the event if you're interested in buying the book. It's really cool. I have not read all of it, full disclosure, but I've read enough to be like, oh my God, this is awesome. Because it's everything you possibly want to know about bread. And also Eric weaves in some fun, like personal anecdotes and some very weird stories as well. And that part is the best. And at the same time, while we're thinking about history, it also can connect you to more recent history. Like, Austin, you talked about how your dad just started making sourdough starter in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. Like those things are more recent history to us, but they're still part of our history and part of our heritage. And so by making bread with that, you're also connecting to him at that point in time. So mindfulness, I always think about is like really about connection, not just with ourselves in this present moment, but also with the past and what we can and how we can relate to the past. And we have a couple more minutes. So I'm curious, like, Eric, can you talk a little bit about like the function of shaping and scoring bread? How that changes based on culture. You kind of teased a lot of it with the flatbread conversation. And then maybe demo how you really like to score for us.
Yeah.
And apologies on the spotlight. I keep forgetting to switch the spotlight. So it's just been on Eric. But like if you're making this kind of not real time, you can follow along with the scoring piece.
So I brought so during COVID, people went a little crazy with design work, and you can get into this kind of thing and go from functional, which is, let's just make a slice across the top, to getting very creative and very, very fancy. I'm not great at the fancy ones. I always try because like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to turn out a bread that, that had any of these designs on it? Like, oh man, that'd be amazing. But it never quite works out that way. And so I'm going to show you a simple way to make a cut. And so to do that, here's the technique I'm using now, which is I use parchment paper. And that's just to keep it from sticking while it's baking. And I used to have, again, the shower cap. Keep the top moist. And I used to bake in a Dutch oven and have a terrible time flipping the dough into the Dutch oven, which I preheated to 475 degrees. And I would burn the top of my hands. I would hit the side of the pot. And so this discovery, this is another hack, is I put my and this, I have a peel, but any cookie sheet will do, right? So I just put this on here and now I flip. And here's another hack on that. And what you see here looks like flour and is not. And this is a really key ingredient. It's rice flour. Okay, so why rice flour? Because rice flour, if you remember here, only wheat flour has gluten in it. And wheat flour, if you just moisten it, will line up the gluten all by itself, which is to say, if I line my bowl with flour, which is what they tell you to do, and the dough is wet, it's going to stick because it's going to build gluten to the flour that's on the side. Whereas if I use rice flour, it doesn't stick because rice flour doesn't have any gluten. So that's a great, another little trick. So, and then you can buy a fancy, what they call a lamb, which is just a razor blade, a straight razor, but just a serrated knife works as well as anything. And again, just to make the one I made before, I'm just making a cut. And that's it. You'll see I'll try and make a cross cut. And when I do, it always stretches across. I don't know how they do it. You'll see also it's at an angle, right? It's sort of a 45-degree angle, but it sort of distorts the middle a little bit. Anyway, good enough. I'm going to put this in the oven. Rachel, you pitch the museum if you want to.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, Eric, for demoing your favorite way to do a score. I actually sent out one that I don't know if any of you guys saw it, but I experimented with doing scoring that looks like a smiley face, which actually turned out pretty well. I'll see if I can pull up a picture while we're talking. I wanted to just kind of like thank you guys all for coming to this event. This is something that's new for us, and I hope that we can do future versions of it because we've heard from a number of our members. Oh, here we go. Here's my smiley face spread.
I love
Thank you. We've heard from a number of members that they're really interested in having more mindfulness in food materials and thinking about not only like who we are in the present moment, but how that connects to history and culture and all of that. So thank you so much for coming. Right now we are fundraising for Colorado Gives Day / Giving Tuesday. So please donate if you feel so moved, if you enjoyed this program. And I also encourage you again to buy Eric's book. It's incredible. Like you will learn, like there are recipes included. You'll learn history and culture from literally like what we know about the start of bread baking to present day. I have one question for you, Eric, before we get to the like final wrap up thing.
Yes.
What is next for you? Like what do you have planned going on now?
Great. So I want to demonstrate. I want to demo one more thing.
Okay.
So this is the dough that we were playing with before, and when you do this stretch and fold method every half hour or so, each time you come back to it, it stretches a little bit higher, like and a little bit higher, and that's sort of when you know, and it gets a little tighter and a little drier. So I want to see if that's true. This is only the second round. Again, wet hands, so it doesn't stick to your hand so much. But it's getting there, right? And it's starting to hang together the way Rachel's did. And it's sticking to my hand less and less. And so 2 more rounds, I think, and it'll be ready for what they call bulk fermentation.
Oh, nice.
So that's coming along nicely. And this is another trick. So as often happens, and so I think this is what gives sourdough a bad rap, is it takes you'll see the way I've done it, which is like I mix the ingredients, I give it a stretch and fold, and I walk away. And we often describe it as 15 minutes of work spread out over 2 days. And right, like you saw how long it took to make a slash or to put it in this bowl, right? It just takes a minute, but you have to be around for a couple of days. But often happens is what's going to happen tonight. So here on the East Coast, it's 7:30, and this is going to take a couple more folds, and then it's going to have to rise. I'm going to put this in the refrigerator tonight, as it is, and then it will tell all those bacteria and yeast take a rest. Tomorrow morning, I'll warm it up and I'll bake it tomorrow. And in fact, that's what we call called a retard or a slow down rise, imparts more flavors than you ordinarily would get in a quick rise. And for sure, you get more flavors with a sourdough than you do with yeasted bread, because yeast doesn't have any bacteria in it, and the bacteria are what's giving it lots of flavor. Anyway, I am what's coming next. I am agonizing my way through a proposal for another book about how many people does it take to make a loaf of bread is the primary question. And I started by thinking, well, if I can do it by myself, take one person. And then I thought, well, I can't do it by myself because I can only do it if I have wheat flour. And I only have wheat flour if a farmer grows wheat flour for me. And that's actually not true, because the wheat has to get by truck to a grain elevator, from the grain elevator to a mill, and from the mill to the store. And actually, before the farmer plants any seeds, he's got to buy seeds, and then they have to have fertilizers and pesticides and stuff. So I'm trying to figure out how many people does it take really to make a loaf of bread, and how much energy does it take? Like, it's not just my oven that's running now, but all of those processes that preceded my bread also took energy. And I want to know if I get more calories out of eating bread than it took to actually make the bread.
Ooh. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to read that book. So I hope
Yeah, I can't either.
puzzles approved, and you can write it soon.
Yeah.
Awesome. And just okay, final question just for you all to think about as you think about mindfulness and food. This is a question that my mentor actually has asked me. But it is, what practices would you like to begin and sustain as you think about mindfulness and your food practices? And I just encourage you to think about that throughout the next day or so, as you go. Oh, Eric shared in his chat, and I'll share in the email following his information as well, plus his link to the book and the recording and all of that jazz. So, but just think about what practices you'd like to begin and sustain as you start baking bread and as you start being more mindful in your life. And without further ado, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it for spending an hour with us.
Yep, send us questions.
Yes.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, y'all, for a very thoughtful programming evening, and have a restful evening.
Thank you. You too.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye-bye.